Hey everybody! I've sneaked back to the studio and I thought I would do a quick video on how to pad up a dress form because Abby Cox requested it. So girl, this one's for you. First off, let's start with just talking about dress forms in general. So this is what we tend to use. This is a plastic form inside. The higher end ones like PMG or Wolf are usually a more like a paper mache type material inside. The ones you can get on Amazon are plastic, covered with a thin layer of batting and then a plain cotton over top. Some of these dress forms have collapsible shoulders. She does not because she is one of the ones that comes with arms. That works. Okay, so these forms are under $200 usually on Amazon, and Roxy Forms is one of the places that sells them, one of the Amazon shops that sells them. I think they're fine. The first thing that usually goes on them is the raising and lowering mechanism, which requires you to take it apart and get in there and mess with some washers. But as far as a basic dress form, I like these. A lot of people will ask me about the collapsible forms. They think that having a collapsible form is better because it lets you easily change the size and shape. That's not exactly true. Personally, I would never recommend a collapsible form for a couple of reasons. The first being, you have cracks here, center back, waist, all of the places where if you're draping a pattern, you need to pin. So you have expansion gaps there and there's nothing, it's just air. The second thing is that you don't get the right shape as you size up. So even though you've expanded that form, let's say you want to add 4 inches to the bust. You've expanded the bust 4 inches on that form, but have you really? What you've actually done is expanded the chest as well and across the back. So the bust itself, this video is just gonna be me like feeling up dress forms, so get ready. The bust shape itself, that size, that cup size has not changed. You have just spread apart and widened here, but this shape remains the same. So in the theater industry and fashion industry, what we tend to like to do instead is pad up a hard form. Now let's talk about the shape of this lady here real quick. Most dress forms are pretty long from waist to under bust. That seems to be a pretty standard thing. Dress form shapes have changed over time throughout history, but in the last 30, 40 years, they haven't changed all that much. Dress forms are fairly long-waisted. For someone like me, that's actually great, because if you look at my proportions, I am like similarly long here, but for a lot of people, this is much shorter. And so that's something you run into. The other thing you run into is that these forms tend to have very good posture. I have much more curve across here. I've got more built shoulders from sewing. I've got a little bit more of a hunch because I slouch from sewing. So that back shape is very different. And the other issue is usually they have a pretty flat butt. So they're usually pretty long through here and through here, honestly. They're usually just very long compared to a lot of people. I'm gonna speak in broad general terms here, talking about averages. Real people come in all shapes and sizes, but dress forms don't. But I'm gonna show you how to fix that. For instance, this back neck to waist measurement is 15.5. It's on like the higher side of average. This girl is in size 0, so she's pretty small. Currently, she measures 32 bust, 24 waist. That's another thing. Dress forms tend to have very small waists, which is actually kind of nice for a step I'm going to show you in a minute. So let's just say, for simplicity's sake, that we want to make this dress form work for, let's say, like an actress who is 2 inches bigger in the bust and waist, also the hips, so we'll just add 2 inches everywhere, and who is also an inch shorter through here. Her waist needs to go up an inch. What I like to use for padding is that pre-quilted batting stuff, the kind you can get at Joann's or at most fabric stores. I like the one that is fabric on both sides, and I just cut bias strips of the stuff and keep it in my fabric stash. I keep a bin of the stuff, and then I have different size pieces that I can use. If I'm padding up a lot, like let's say when I first got started, I needed to pad up a dress form probably 10 dress sizes. Sometimes I'll go straight to like bath towels. So a couple things first before we get started. You want to keep an eye on staying symmetrical in your padding unless the person you're padding up for is markedly different. Focus on symmetricality. If you think about this like sculpture, that will get you far. So you're looking at volumes and you're looking at shapes. You're not just looking at measurements. If you have someone, like let's say you're padding it for yourself, and you know you have quite a sway back and you have a protruding belly, you want to pad up more here. You don't want to pad up the same amount all the way around here to get that new measurement. I'm fuller here than most dress forms are. So that's one place where I tend to add padding as well, is on the sides of my hips. So I've got my materials, and now what I'm gonna do is just scrounge up some good size pieces and start pinning. The bias is nice because it lets it kind of spread out over the body. Now you don't necessarily have to have symmetrical pieces to get a symmetrical fit. You just have to keep aware of how many layers you've added which places. If you notice, I'm kind of snugging this up above the waistline a little bit here. What that's gonna do is help shift her waist up later. I did take some of my padding back to the shed, so I'm working with some scrappier scraps than I usually am here, but you guys will get the idea. So I'm gonna put in a piece here that kind of mimics that shape. It's really just like adding layers of a sculpture. If you've ever taken a studio art class or sculpture class, kind of try to tap into that mentality as you're working on this. I'm gonna add a little bit more right over the front here because often people have a little bit more there than most dress forms. This is a nice big piece that's gonna do a whole lot at once for us. Tailoring shoulder pads can work great for padding as well. And I'm really only sticking a few pins in here and there. That's all you really need. Any more, and then when you try to unpin it later, you've created a huge, like, pin cushion, pin trap for yourself. Okay, so we've got a little bit more in the belly, which is good for the shape I've decided to go for with her, but her butt is looking really flat. So I'm gonna add a little bit more just back there. I'm making up a person's shape for this. You know, I'm not basing it on any specific person, but if you are, like you're probably padding up the form to fit yourself or to fit a performer. If it's a performer and you're working ahead of time and you haven't actually seen them in person, hopefully you've been able to get photos taken from when they came in for measurements. Hopefully there's photos as well. Often you get a front, side, and back shot from the larger costume shops when they do measurements, and that can be really helpful to get a sense of where people carry their weight and how their posture sits. So she's got a little more booty now. Let's check and see what we've done, because adding just a couple layers can really up the inches very quickly. Yep, so she was at 34 and now she is at 36 at the low hip. 26, so she was 24, now she's at 26. So we only had to add that much padding to get 2 inches worth of expansion. Let's say that this person, well, let's look at your under bust, honey. 28, yeah, that's pretty small. A lot of people are more in the 29 to 30 range in this size range. So we're gonna go ahead and give her a little bit more under bust. You can also use just regular quilt batting, but it's a little bit harder to pin in place and it's very sticky and clingy, which is harder to work with. But if that's all you got, that will work too. Now I usually work kind of waist, hips area up. That's just a personal preference. It doesn't really matter, except that it's helpful to establish where your waist is before you kind of work up from there. Okay, so we're gonna say that her back neck to waist is 1 inch shorter than the dress forms. So we're gonna say it's 14.5. That puts it right here. What I'll usually do then is stick a pin in that spot so I know where it is. Also, for simplicity's sake, I'm gonna say that her waistline is parallel to the floor. So next what I'm going to do to mark my new waistline is take a piece of ribbon. This is actually some black Prussian tape. It's nice because it's pretty rigid and it's not super wiggly. It keeps a nice crisp edge. And I'm going to pin that snugly in place at that pin. And now I'm going to look at where I have this waistline sitting. For some people, the waistline does tip down in the front. So for some people, you actually do want it to drop a little bit in the front. Okay, yeah, so that's more or less even. I can see a little bit of the original tape over here and a little crack between some of the padding, and I can see that it is about an inch higher than the original tape. So I'm in the right spot, and I'm going to pin that in place around the form. Okay, and just to make sure, I'm gonna double check that waist measurement. 26. Okay, we're good. That's what we're going for. So now we're at the bust. So this is gonna take a little bit more finessing, and it depends a bit on what you're making. If you're making something kind of loosey-goosey, not too fitted, you don't have to go super crazy about getting all of this very nice. But if you're making a fitted Victorian bodice or something like that, you really want to get all of the back, across the back area and the bust area pretty accurate to the wearer. We're at 32, we want to go to 34. I'm going to say that that 2 inches on our mystery girl is partially on her back, because I'm going to say that she has a little bit more of a built back like I do, and a little bit more on her bust. Sometimes I'll use shoulder pads back here if someone's got a really pronounced slope. I almost always add padding to the back here when I'm padding up a form, because very few people have the perfectly flat posture and spine of these dress forms. One thing you can do if you don't like the look of all of this on your dress form, before you do the waistline marking, you can actually create a tube out of some very stretchy jersey or double knit and pull that over top of the form, and that'll smooth everything out and give it a nice smooth base. I don't bother with that. We've added a little bit more to her back. Now we're gonna add a little bit more to her bust. If you have like the foam bust cups, you can just add those if that's the right amount to add to the bust. Sometimes I'll add an old bra even if I'm working at a theater and I have access to their bra stock, but right now I don't. I'm also going to say that she's got a little bit more, it really is like sculpture, it's like paper mache or something. I'm gonna run that underneath. That's actually dropping the bust line ever so slightly by filling in underneath. Bust cups are expensive, so if you don't have them, you don't necessarily need them. So I'm not gonna use them today, so you can kind of see how to do this with just padding. Okay. I think we're gonna go. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there we go. That's it. That's what I want. I'm adding a little bit more fullness through here. I'm basically just enlarging the cup. I'm sure everyone's wondering, how do you do this with a corset? That's basically the same thing. The thing you want to do though is start with a dress form with a waist that is at least as small as your corseted waist, if not smaller, and then pad up from there. So usually what I will do at that stage, and I don't actually have any corsets here right now because I took all the stock to the shed. Yes, watch our shed series if you want to watch me slowly lose my mind working by myself. So I can't show you the corseted version of this today, but it is very similar. So you would put the corset on to the dress form and then pad out within the corset to fit. You usually have to pad up into the hips and in the bust area if you've picked a dress form with a waist that is your corseted waist. It means the whole thing is going to be small. And then often you do want to do that fill in back here. That's one spot I always pad if I've got a corset on a form. If you watch my making of my Meg March gown video, you will see that I put some really haphazard, honestly, padding in the back there, and I also padded through here as well on me because I'm a little wider than this form. And I also had to pad the hips significantly because my hips are like 4 inches bigger form, although because it was an 1860s gown, that was less important. Here we have some bust padding. Ta-da! It's not pretty, but it'll get the job done. 33.5. So if we were going for 34, we would want to add just a touch more to this. One thing you need to watch as well is that the bust point line is in the right spot for the person. The one thing you really can't mess with too much on padding a form is if the distance from like here, like underarm to here is shorter on your person. Like if they are short through here, this is difficult to alter. So often what I'll do is I'll get the pattern draped as close as I can on the form, and then I'll do a shoulder adjustment in the fitting where I undo the shoulder seam, spread everything up, and repin. If I'm not doing a fitting, then I will compare measurements very closely and usually take a little bit of height out through here and through here, unless they have sway back in the flat patterning stage. Now let's say you're trying to hit a specific measurement and you're just not getting there. You are over it. One cheat that I sometimes do is I'll get one side padded up to half of the measurements I need, and then I won't worry as much about getting the other side perfect. Usually if you're draping a pattern, you're only patterning half unless it's something very asymmetrical. And so then I'll just use that side. Hey, 34, we did it. Now I haven't altered anything on her shoulder width. I'm saying that she has the same shoulder width as this form for simplicity's sake, but you can pad out a little bit more on the shoulders if you are going to do a form with arms. Could actually add a little bit more through here if you needed to. If you're working with someone with broader arms, like for instance, I have a lot more up here, you could pad out here if you're doing a really fitted sleeve that you're trying to fine tune on the form. And one way to get the sense of if this circumference is the same is honestly just measure around your shoulders. So you can actually take that measurement if you're working with a form with arms and compare it to the form. If you're working with a form without arms, so one of the collapsible models, like this lady, so that's so you can get dresses on and off easier. Obviously doesn't have quite a full shoulder. It's cutting off kind of where a sleeve cap would on her. So you just have to be aware of whether that point matches in width. So you can do your across shoulder front and back measurements like here and on the back and check those to the body you're working with. You can add a little bit here, or you can mark in on the shoulder with a pin or a piece of ribbon where that actually should sit. All right, there's one last thing that I always like to do. Once I've padded up a form and I've got it to the right measurements, you want to mark center front and center back. That will help you in the draping stage later because now you've lost that seam line that's on the original form and you don't really know where you're at. I'm eyeballing the middle, but I can actually feel the seam still through this padding. If you can't feel it, eyeball it and then measure and do some cross-referencing side to side to see if you're in the right spot. You can mark the side seams as well if you would like. You can actually use this technique to mark out seam lines for a planned bodice or garment and then drape to those lines. So for instance, you could mark a fiddleback or princess seams with the ribbon and then come in and drape your pieces and just follow the lines you've already set out for yourself. One thing to watch for at this point is you want to double check that you really are at half. Because if I put these ribbons in the wrong spots and I drape everything off of one side, if I've somehow made that side like a ½ inch or an inch smaller or bigger, my sizing is going to be off. So what I'll do is I'll measure half and make sure that's half of the measurement that it should be. So that's 13, so that's great because we're going for a 36-inch waist. Bust should be 17. Is that right? Yes, that is right. There's a fun little trick for you guys too. So if you're not the best at mental math, you can just double your measuring tapes. I do this trick all the time. 36. You can also mark the hip line, the bust line with ribbon if you'd like. There's all sorts of markings you can do. It's a matter of personal preference, and it depends on your project. You may not need all these markings for every project. I have also seen people wrap their forms once they've padded them with strips of muslin, so it's kind of like the mummy effect to help smooth things and clean it up a little bit better. Another trick you can do if you're trying to get a fuller, heavier bust on the form, especially if you're doing historical looks where you've got a corset and you kind of want a bust that sits into the corset, you can make bags of beans or rice and suspend that from the shoulders. A lot of people will just use pantyhose, and then that can actually add some extra in there. Okay, so that is the basics of pinning. Okay, so that's the basics of padding up a dress form. I hope this was helpful. It's pretty simple. I didn't get too fancy or technical with this. Really all you need to make this easy for yourself is some of this batting and pins and some ribbon or tape or whatever to mark your lines, and of course a tape measure and the measurements of the person you're trying to fit. So this is why I tend to start with forms that are smaller. I always buy smaller forms and then pad up from there. Very rarely are forms the right shape, even if the measurements are the same as the wearer. For instance, let's talk about plus sizing for a moment. This is an 18 according to this dress forms company's size chart. She has a 35.5-inch waist, but she is not really the shape of most women who have these measurements. She is really flat in the front, which is generally unrealistic. Usually we've got a little bit more fullness through here. She's also really flat back here. She does have a pretty good width through the hip from the front, but she's just really flat front and back. And that doesn't necessarily correspond to how a lot of women are shaped who have her size range. The other thing is, look at that crazy flat back. Like, her back is really long. Yeah, it's 17.5. That is a common thing you encounter with pattern grading, is that the larger the size is, the taller it is. That's not necessarily true. Just because you're tall doesn't mean you're larger. Just because you're larger doesn't mean you're tall at all. This form, for most people, when I'm using this form, I have to take length out of my patterns through here and here. Or if I'm padding, I make very sure to raise the waist while padding the hip, as I did on that form over there. It's more important, it's even more important to get that up for this, especially because often on larger sizes, you don't see this much of a difference from underbust to waist either. Again, that's about the same as size 0 over there, 4.5. And you know, again, people come in all shapes and sizes, but those are some of the common issues that people have with these dress forms. So yeah, usually when I'm padding this form, I'm padding up, I'm raising the waist, I'm adding to the front, and often I'm increasing bust size, but it just depends on the person, and adding more to the back here. Those are the most common things I do to this form when I'm trying to resize it. All right, well, I hope that was somewhat informative, and if you liked this video, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you want to help us out in these crazy times, you can support us on Patreon, and you can shop red threaded corsets, kids, patterns, and so much more at redthreaded.com. Happy sewing, everybody.